They never wore a crown. They never sat on a throne. Yet their whispers shaped empires, their signatures decided wars, and their ambitions toppled monarchs. These were the shadow rulers, cardinals, advisors, concubines, eunuchs, mothers, the ones who held true power without the title. In the official records, they were footnotes, but behind closed doors, they were the architects of history. This is the story of those who ruled from the shadows, and sometimes burned in them throughout history. The image of a monarch crowned, cloaked in robes, seated on a gilded throne, has symbolized ultimate authority. But this image, powerful as it is, often concealed a more complex reality. The throne, while a visual centerpiece of rule, did not always house the true source of command. Many who wore the crown issued decrees and led ceremonies, yet behind them, in private chambers or council halls, others made the real decisions. Power and perception have rarely aligned perfectly. Some kings were too young, too weak, too distracted, or too indifferent to govern effectively. In their place, advisors, regents, and even unofficial confidants stepped forward. These figures, often unelected and unelevated, shaped the fate of empires quietly, decisively, and sometimes ruthlessly. In medieval Europe, one of the most striking examples emerged in the English court during the early 1500s. Henry VIII, known for his break with the Catholic Church and his many marriages, is remembered as a domineering monarch. But in the first 2 decades of his reign, England was functionally steered by Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, a son of a butcher from Ipswich. Wolsey rose through the church and state to become Lord Chancellor. Henry appeared to lead, but Wolsey negotiated treaties, orchestrated foreign policy, and even drafted legislation. His signature wasn't always on the orders, but his influence was unmistakable in France. The 17th century court of Louis XIII presented a similar illusion. Louis held the crown, but Cardinal Richelieu directed the state. As chief minister, Richelieu laid the foundations for an absolute monarchy, not by sitting on the throne, but by controlling those who did. He subdued the nobility, reformed the army, and reshaped France's role in European politics. Though officially just a servant of the king, his word often carried more weight than the monarch's. In the Qing dynasty of China, Empress Dowager Cixi never held the formal title of emperor, but she wielded imperial power for nearly half a century. After entering the Forbidden City as a low-ranking concubine, she gave birth to the emperor's only son when he ascended the throne. At just 5 years old, Cixi became regent. Officially, she acted in his name. In reality, she ruled through him and, later, through 2 successive puppet emperors. By controlling access to the emperor, managing court factions, and eliminating rivals, she governed the world's largest empire without ever wearing the imperial crown. Ottoman politics offered another variation of this pattern. The title of Sultan carried immense symbolic weight, but in practice, Grand Viziers often held the reins of government. KPRL Mehmed Pasha, for example, became Grand Vizier in 1656 and swiftly took over day-to-day governance. The empire, struggling under military and financial strain, began to recover under his leadership, not through the Sultan's will, but through the Grand Vizier's strict policies and decisive military campaigns. In Istanbul, the Sultan remained the religious and ceremonial figurehead, while the Vizier directed the empire's machinery. Even in ancient Rome, long before the emergence of hereditary monarchies, the concept of hidden influence was deeply embedded. During the early Principate, emperors like Augustus, maintained the facade of republican rule. The Senate still convened. Traditional offices still functioned, but Augustus held Imperium Maius the greater power. He ruled not by declaring himself king, but by concentrating authority through titles like princeps or first citizen. The illusion of a functioning republic persisted, even as real control had shifted permanently to the imperial household. In many of these cases, power did not come from official rank. It came from proximity. Those closest to the ruler, favorites, lovers, regents could shape decisions in ways the public never saw. Sometimes their names faded into obscurity. Other times, they left behind legacies that outlasted the monarchs themselves. This recurring dynamic wasn't confined to a single culture or era. In India, the Maratha Empire saw figures like Nana Fadnavis, the Peishwa's advisor, control vast stretches of territory in the late 1700s. In Renaissance Italy, the Medici family ruled Florence behind the scenes, long before any of them held formal ducal titles. And in 20th century Germany, Hitler's inner circle, particularly Joseph Goebbels and Heinrich Himmler, exercised authority that even rivaled or influenced the Führer's decisions in key areas. These hidden rulers operated in many forms, some with ambition, others out of necessity. Some stabilized their realms, others plunged them into chaos. But across centuries and continents, they shared a common reality. They did not need a throne to rule. The image of the sovereign remains powerful. Statues, portraits, coins, and chronicles celebrate the crowned and the titled. But behind many of those faces stood another someone less visible, often more strategic, sometimes more dangerous. In understanding history, the question is not just who wore the crown, but who held the real control behind it. France, early 17th century, the kingdom stood at a crossroads, still fractured from the aftershocks of the wars of religion. It was a realm of competing nobles, fragile borders, and internal unrest. Louis XIII wore the crown, but he was young, cautious, and frequently ill. Into this unstable landscape stepped Armand Jean Duplessis, a man not born to power, but determined to master it. Cardinal Richelieu, as he came to be known, was not just a churchman. He was a political strategist of rare precision. Appointed chief minister in 1624, Richelieu would go on to serve as the principal architect of the modern French state. Over the next 2 decades, he centralized authority, dismantled noble resistance, and extended France's influence on the European stage, all while maintaining the fiction that he served only at the pleasure of the king. Richelieu's rise began through the church. Born in 1585 to a noble but financially strained family, he entered clerical service to protect the family's position. In 1607, at just 22 years old, he became Bishop of Lucan. By 1622, he had secured the red hat of a cardinal. His political talents quickly caught the eye of Queen Mother Marie de' Medici, and through her influence, he gained entry to the royal council. Louis XIII, wary of his mother's manipulations, was initially reluctant, but Richelieu's values soon became undeniable. From the beginning, Richelieu's policies were rooted in one principle: the supremacy of the crown. He viewed the nobility as a threat to state stability, and he moved systematically to curtail their power. The era's great aristocratic families still maintained private armies and fortified castles, remnants of feudal autonomy. Richelieu targeted both. He issued royal decrees demanding the destruction of unlicensed fortifications and banned dueling, which was as much a political statement as a personal affront. Dozens of nobles were imprisoned or executed under his watch, not for rebellion in arms, but for defiance of central authority. One of his most significant tests came in 1626, with the Chalais conspiracy, a plot among high-ranking nobles to assassinate Richelieu and seize control of the king's inner circle. Among the conspirators was Henry de Talleyrand Perigord, the Count of Chalais. Richelieu responded swiftly. Trials were held, and Chalais was executed. The message was clear. The days of noble impunity were ending. Religious tensions also demanded attention, although France was officially Catholic. The 1598 Edict of Nantes had granted substantial rights to the Huguenots, the country's Protestant minority. Richelieu saw their fortified towns and independent militias as a challenge to royal sovereignty. In 1627, he moved against the Protestant stronghold of La Rochelle, which had aligned itself with England. The resulting siege, lasting over a year, ended in a devastating defeat for the city. In 1629, the Peace of Allies confirmed Huguenot religious freedom but stripped away their military privileges. It was a calculated compromise, tolerance without autonomy abroad. Richelieu pursued a foreign policy that baffled traditionalists. Although a Catholic cardinal, he allied France with Protestant powers against the Catholic Habsburgs during the 30 Years' War. His reasoning was geopolitical, not religious. The Habsburgs, who ruled both Spain and the Holy Roman Empire in France, Richelieu believed that breaking their dominance was essential to securing France's position in Europe. In 1635, France formally entered the war. French troops fought in Germany, the Low Countries, and Italy. The campaigns were costly, but they achieved their strategic aims. By the time of the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, 5 years after Richelieu's death, France had emerged as a dominant continental power. Throughout his tenure, Richelieu maintained a careful relationship with Louis XIII, though the king at times resented his minister's power. He also relied on his competence. The balance between service and control was delicate. Richelieu always spoke of loyalty and obedience to the crown, yet he often acted without consulting the monarch directly. In practice, he became the state. He also controlled the machinery of information. Richelieu expanded the use of royal spies, maintained detailed reports on court intrigue, and suppressed publications critical of the regime. In 1631, he even helped found La Gazette, France's first official newspaper, to control the narrative around government actions. Propaganda, surveillance, censorship, all became tools of governance. Richelieu's policies were not universally popular. His tax reforms placed heavy burdens on the peasantry, and his suppression of regional privileges angered many. Revolts flared in various provinces, yet he remained in power, supported by the king and protected by an ever-growing state apparatus. By the time of his death, in December 1642, Richelieu had reshaped France. He left behind a centralized monarchy, a weakened nobility, a professionalized army, and a vastly expanded bureaucracy. His successor, Cardinal Mazarin, and his pupil, the young Louis XIV, would build on this foundation. The Sun King's absolute monarchy, famously declared with the words "L'État c'est moi," would not have been possible without the groundwork laid by Richelieu. He never claimed the throne, never led an army in battle, and never wore a crown. Yet for nearly 2 decades, Richelieu wielded a level of control unmatched by any French king of his time. The man in red robes, speaking softly behind closed doors, ruled not by divine right but by strategy, discipline, and an unshakable belief in the power of the state. In 1852, a 16-year-old girl entered the Forbidden City as a low-ranking concubine. She was one of many chosen for the Shunfeng Emperor, a distant figure she was expected to serve, obey, and never outshine. Her name was Ye Henara Shingen. In time, the world would know her as Empress Dowager Cixi, the woman who would dominate the Qing court for nearly 5 decades. Cixi's ascent began quietly. In 1856, she gave birth to the emperor's only surviving son, Zikdun. That single event changed her trajectory. No longer a peripheral figure in the imperial harem, she became the mother of the heir to the throne. In a palace governed by hierarchy and lineage, this elevated her above nearly every other woman. Still, she remained one voice among many, overshadowed by Empress Suzhen, the emperor's primary consort. In 1861, the Shunfeng emperor died while the Qing dynasty faced severe internal strain. The Second Opium War had exposed China's military inferiority. Foreign powers carved out concessions, and the devastating Taiping Rebellion continued to destabilize the empire. His 5-year-old son, now the Tongzhi emperor, was far too young to rule. A regency was needed. Before his death, Xianfeng had appointed a council of 8 conservative ministers to govern in the child's name. But Cixi, allied with Empress Zun and Prince Gong, engineered a palace coup. The plan was executed with precision. Within weeks of Xianfeng's funeral, the regency was dissolved. The empresses Dowager, Zuin, and Cixi were declared co-regents. The 8 ministers were either dismissed, imprisoned, or compelled to commit suicide. Cixi, officially just a guardian to the emperor, was now in command. Over the next 2 decades, she operated from behind a silk screen during court audiences, in keeping with Manchu custom. The child emperor sat in front. She sat behind, listening, whispering, deciding. Ministers presented policies to the throne, but real approval came from the Empress Dowager. Her grip on power was neither accidental nor passive. She carefully cultivated loyalty from officials, removed rivals, and ensured she controlled palace access. When the Tongzhi emperor died in 1875, at age 18 likely, from smallpox, he left no heir. Cixi, breaking with tradition, installed her 3-year-old nephew as the next emperor. He became the Guangxu emperor. Once again, she positioned herself as regent, at a time when Qing China was struggling to maintain sovereignty against foreign intervention. Cixi maintained a precarious balance between reform and control. She allowed the self-strengthening movement to precede a limited modernization effort aimed at improving military and industrial capabilities. Chinese arsenals were established, foreign technologies, including the telegraph and railroads, were introduced. Naval modernization was attempted through the Beiyang fleet, but these reforms were tightly restricted. Cixi distrusted radical change, particularly if it threatened Manchu authority or her own position. She blocked proposals for constitutional monarchy, resisted broad educational reform, and maintained strict control over court appointments. Critics often labeled her reactionary, yet her caution reflected a political environment already straining under external pressure and internal fragmentation. In 1884, China entered the Sino-French War over control of Vietnam. Despite some military successes, the Qing were forced to recognize French dominance. This failure, combined with corruption in the army and weak naval preparedness, damaged her legitimacy. The Beiyang fleet, meant to be the pride of China's modernization, became a symbol of bureaucratic failure. Then came the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894. Japan, once a subordinate neighbor, had rapidly industrialized and westernized after the Meiji Restoration. In contrast, the Qing court lagged behind. The war ended in humiliation for China. Taiwan was ceded to Japan, Korea was lost as a vassal state, and indemnities were paid. The defeat shattered any illusion that cautious reform had been sufficient. Following the defeat, reformist voices within the court gained traction. In 1898, under pressure from intellectuals and younger officials, the Guangxu Emperor launched the 100 Days Reform, a rapid campaign to overhaul the education system, modernize the bureaucracy, and curtail conservative influence at court. Cixi viewed this as a direct threat. In September 1898, she staged a coup, placed the emperor under house arrest, and executed or exiled many of the reformers, including the prominent scholar Kong Yui. She resumed full control, ruling in the emperor's name but confining him to a life of ceremonial irrelevance. Her actions in 1898 hardened her image among Chinese reformers and foreign observers. To conservatives, she was a protector of tradition. To others, a regressive force stalling China's chance at real recovery. In 1900, the Boxer Rebellion further tested her leadership. The uprising, led by anti-foreign militia groups, erupted across northern China. At first, the court hesitated, but when foreign legations were besieged in Beijing, Cixi declared war on 8 foreign powers. The decision proved disastrous. Allied forces invaded the capital, and the court was forced to flee to Shan. Following their return to Beijing, Cixi signed the Boxer Protocol in 1901, imposing heavy reparations and further eroding Qing sovereignty. In her final years, Cixi adjusted course. She began a series of late reforms, including plans for constitutional monarchy, modernization of the military, and abolition of the imperial examination system. But by then, momentum had already shifted. Revolutionary movements were gaining ground, and the dynasty was nearing collapse. Cixi died in November 1908, just a day after the death of the Guangxu Emperor. Rumors persist that she ordered his poisoning to ensure no reversal of her policies. While never conclusively proven, his sudden death mere hours before her own remains one of the final enigmas of her reign. She never sat on the throne, never held the mandate of heaven in her name, yet she ruled the empire longer than any Qing emperor of the 19th century. Her legacy is divided. Some view her as a shrewd stabilizer who preserved a crumbling dynasty in a time of crisis. Others see her as an obstruction to progress, a ruler who clung to personal power while the empire unraveled behind silk curtains and carved screens. She shaped the fate of a nation through diplomacy, calculation, and survival. Cixi was never meant to rule, but she did. Absolutely. Russia. 1905. The empire stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific, vast, rigid, and already cracking beneath the weight of its own contradictions. The Romanov dynasty, more than 300 years old, faced growing unrest. Peasants were starving. Workers were striking. Revolutionary ideas were spreading. And in the center of it all, the Tsar and his wife turned to an outsider for guidance. Not a statesman, not a general, not a priest, but a wandering Siberian mystic named Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was born in 1869 in the small village of Pokrovskoe in western Siberia. Little in his early life marked him for what was to come. He received no formal education. He worked the land like others in his village. But after a religious awakening in his late 20s, he left his family and began wandering between monasteries and holy sites, embracing a life of asceticism, mysticism, and controversial spiritual practices. His reputation as a holy man grew not through official channels of the Orthodox Church, but through whispers and rumors, healings, visions, and a personal magnetism that unsettled many. By the early 1900s, Rasputin had made his way to St. Petersburg, the imperial capital. The Russian aristocracy was increasingly drawn to mysticism, spiritualism, and occult practices, perhaps out of boredom, perhaps out of fear of a crumbling world order. Rasputin's arrival coincided with a crisis at the heart of the Romanov family. The heir to the throne, Tsarevich Alexei, had been born with hemophilia, a genetic blood disorder inherited from Queen Victoria and passed through Alexandra the Tsarina. Every injury, no matter how minor, carried the risk of death. In 1906, Rasputin was introduced to the imperial couple. Almost immediately, Alexandra believed he had a divine gift. During a flare-up of Alexei's condition, Rasputin was called. After his visit, the bleeding stopped. Whether due to the calming effect of Rasputin's presence, his insistence on stopping medical treatments that may have worsened the bleeding, or coincidence that Tsarina was convinced Rasputin had saved her son. From that moment on, Rasputin's position was secure not through a formal role, but through access. He became a regular presence at court, often seen praying with the empress, blessing her children, and offering unsolicited advice on matters far beyond religion. Nicholas II, a conservative and distant ruler, initially distrusted the monk, but did not oppose Alexandra's reliance on him. Over time, Rasputin's influence began to seep into the workings of the state. His presence sparked resentment across Russia. To the Orthodox Church, he was a heretic. To the nobility, an embarrassment. To the Duma, a symbol of autocratic decay. Rasputin preached humility but was known for drinking, womanizing, and public outbursts. He was accused of bribery, blackmail, and even seduction of court ladies. Surveillance reports from the Okhrana, the Tsar's secret police, documented his behavior in detail. Still, Alexandra defended him, insisting his actions were misunderstood or exaggerated by enemies of the throne. During World War I, Rasputin's influence reached a dangerous peak. In 1915, Nicholas II took personal command of the Russian military and left the capital. Alexandra remained in Petrograd and, under Rasputin's counsel, began dismissing and appointing ministers at a rapid pace. Experienced officials were replaced by men loyal to Rasputin or approved by the empress. Government stability deteriorated. Corruption spread. Public faith in the monarchy plummeted. By late 1916, Rasputin was not just a scandal. He was widely seen as a national threat. Rumors circulated that he was a German agent working to sabotage the war effort. Although there is no evidence he ever acted against Russia, the perception was enough. Senior members of the aristocracy decided he had to be removed. On the night of December 29, 1916, a group of conspirators led by Prince Felix Yusupov, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, and Vladimir Purishkevich lured Rasputin to the Yusupov palace. Under the pretense of meeting Felix's wife, they served him cakes and wine laced with cyanide. According to some accounts, the poison seemed to have no effect. In a state of confusion or panic, Yusupov shot him. Rasputin collapsed but minutes. Later, he stirred and attempted to escape. He was shot again, then beaten. Finally, his body was thrown into the frozen Neva River. When recovered, his arms were raised, suggesting he had been alive when submerged. Rasputin's murder became legend, shrouded in exaggeration and myth, but the political consequences were real. Alexandra was devastated. Nicholas remained silent. The monarchy's image, already battered by military failures and food shortages, now seemed fully disconnected from reality. The Romanovs had clung to a mystic when they needed a government. Less than 3 months later, the Russian Revolution began. In March 1917, Nicholas II abdicated. The Romanov dynasty collapsed. Some historians argue that Rasputin's influence and the monarchy's refusal to sever ties with him accelerated its downfall. While not the cause of the revolution, he was a symptom of a broader decay, a system unable to reform, unable to adapt, and unable to understand the fury rising. Outside its gates, Rasputin never held office. He issued no laws, he commanded no army, but his presence inside the imperial court, his manipulation of desperation, and the paranoia that surrounded him made him one of the most consequential figures in the final chapter of Imperial Russia. He did not live to see the revolution, but his shadow lingered over the fall of the Romanovs. The monk had died, but the empire soon followed. Japan, 1600. The country stood on the edge of a transformation. For over a century, the islands had been locked in conflict. Daimyo against daimyo, warlord against warlord. The imperial court in Kyoto still held ceremonial power, but real authority had long fractured among regional military strongmen. The Ashikaga shogunate had collapsed, and in its place, chaos had reigned. Into that vacuum stepped Tokugawa Ieyasu, patient, calculating leader whose grip on power would not only reshape Japan, but define it for the next 2.5 centuries. Ieyasu was not born into dominance. He was born Matsuda Takachiyo. In 1543, the son of a minor daimyo in Mikawa province. At the age of 6, he was taken as a hostage by the Imagawa clan, part of a political deal common in the Sengoku period. For over a decade, he lived not as a noble heir, but as a bargaining chip in the brutal chessboard of Japanese feudal warfare. But during that time, he watched, he learned, and he survived. By the 1560s, Ieyasu had allied with Oda Nobunaga, the most powerful warlord of the time. After Nobunaga's death in 1582, Toyotomi Hideyoshi rose to dominance. Ieyasu served under Hideyoshi, but never blindly. He built his own base of power in the east, expanding his holdings and resources. When Hideyoshi died in 1598, a power struggle erupted over the future of Japan. 2 years later, at the Battle of Sekigahara, Ieyasu seized his moment. He led his forces against those loyal to Hideyoshi's son, Toyotomi Hideyori, on October 21st, 1600. After hours of brutal fighting, Ieyasu emerged victorious. It was not just a military win, it was the moment Japan's long civil war effectively ended. In 1603, Ieyasu received the title of Seid Taishogun, barbarian subduing generalissimo, from Emperor Go-Yōzei. But the title was not a reward. It was the legitimization of what had already been achieved by force. Ieyasu now had the mandate to rule, but he never claimed the throne. The emperor remained in Kyoto, revered and untouchable, but politically sidelined. Ieyasu's real work was not conquest, it was construction. The construction of a system that would make the Tokugawa position unassailable. He began by relocating the political center of gravity. His base of power was not in Kyoto, where the imperial court still held symbolic sway, but in Edo Midande, Tokyo. There he built a new capital, designed not just for administration, but for control. In Edo, he was the unquestioned authority. From there, he governed every province through a network of loyal vassals and carefully managed rivals. The Tokugawa system rested on a series of calculated policies. One of the most important was the Sankin-katai system, or alternate attendance. All daimyo were required to spend every other year in Edo, and to leave their families there as effective hostages when they returned to their domains. This drained their treasuries, weakened their independence, and placed them under constant surveillance. At the same time, Ieyasu did not fully eliminate the Toyotomi clanate, at least not at first. He allowed Hidori, still a child, to remain in Osaka Castle. It was a tactical decision, meant to delay conflict until Ieyasu's own power was unshakable. But by 1614, with threats of a Toyotomi revival growing, Ieyasu moved decisively. He ordered the siege of Osaka. After 2 campaigns, Hidori and his mother committed suicide in 1615. The last real challenge to Tokugawa authority was extinguished. Ieyasu also understood the need to define his authority in ideological terms. Although the emperor remained the divine figurehead, Ieyasu framed the Tokugawa shogunate as the legitimate executor of order under imperial sanction. He never challenged the emperor's spiritual status, but ensured that the court had no practical power. In doing so, he wrapped military dictatorship in the appearance of continuity, avoiding direct confrontation with Japan's sacred traditions. One of his final acts was also one of his most enduring. After abdicating in 1605 in favor of his son Hitada, though he continued to rule behind the scenes, Ieyasu began preparing for his own deification. Upon his death in 1616, he was enshrined as Tsh Dagongan, the great incarnation of the Eastern Light. His mausoleum at Niku became a state shrine, reinforcing Tokugawa legitimacy through Shinto ritual and imperial approval. The Tokugawa system was one of hierarchy, control, and isolation. Under Ieyasu's successors, foreign trade was tightly restricted. Christianity, which had spread rapidly under the Jesuits during the late 1500s, was outlawed. Foreign missionaries were expelled. Japanese Christians were persecuted. The policy national seclusion was formalized by the 1630s. The Tokugawa shogunate did not seek empire abroad. It sought stability within, and for over 250 years, it worked. There were no major wars. The daimyo were contained. The emperor remained untouched, and the Tokugawa shoguns ruled from Edo in almost unchallenged authority. Ieyasu's system outlived him by generations, surviving until the arrival of Commodore Perry's black ships in 1853, forced Japan to open to the outside world. By 1868, the shogunate had collapsed, but its founder's shadow stretched across every page of its history. Tokugawa. Ieyasu never claimed to be a revolutionary. He claimed to restore order. He used tradition to mask transformation. He did not wear imperial robes, but his hand was on every decision, every reform, every sword drawn and sheathed across the archipelago. The emperor ruled from Kyoto, but the shogun, quiet, calculating, and always watching, ruled Japan, England. 1515. The Tudor dynasty was just 3 decades old. Henry VIII, in the early years of his reign, was not yet the figure known for 6 wives and a fractured church. He was young, athletic, deeply Catholic, and still reliant on others to steer the machinery of government. Into this role stepped a man whose background defied tradition. Thomas Wolsey, born around 1473 in Ipswich, was the son of a butcher. That alone should have excluded him from the highest ranks of power. But Wolsey possessed something more potent than noble blood ambition: intelligence and an ability to read the currents of court politics with rare precision. He attended Magdalen College at Oxford, became a priest, and quickly caught the attention of the powerful Dot. By 1507, he was serving as royal chaplain under Henry VII. After the king's death in 1509, Wolsey deftly attached himself to the new monarch, Henry VIII, while others at court were still adapting to the young king's style. Wolsey moved quickly to prove his usefulness. He took on administrative burdens that Henry had no interest in: diplomacy, taxation, logistics, and made himself indispensable. In 1515, Wolsey was named Lord Chancellor, the highest legal officer in the realm. That same year, he became a cardinal, appointed by Pope Leo X within the span of a few years. Wolsey had become the most powerful man in England after the king and, in many matters, more powerful than the king himself. He controlled royal patronage, foreign policy, the church in England, and much of the royal household. Diplomats did not just petition the king, they sought the ear of Cardinal Wolsey. Wolsey's style of rule was centralized and personal. He bypassed traditional noble networks, choosing administrators based on loyalty rather than lineage. He expanded the court of Star Chamber, using it to pursue justice against nobles who overstepped. His taxation policies, while controversial, were efficient. He raised money for wars against France and Scotland, and when needed, negotiated peace. Wolsey was instrumental in the Treaty of London. In 1518, a non-aggression pact involving major European powers, including England, France, the Holy Roman Empire, and the papacy. It was hailed across Europe as a diplomatic triumph. For a brief moment, Wolsey positioned England not just as a participant in European affairs, but as a broker of peace. The following year, Wolsey oversaw the Field of the Cloth of Goldan, extravagant summit between Henry VIII and Francis I of France. The event, held near Calais, cost a fortune and showcased England's wealth and culture. But beneath the spectacle, the alliance was fragile. Wolsey continued to maneuver between France and the Habsburgs, attempting to keep England in a position of strategic advantage. His greatest asset and greatest liability was his proximity to Henry. The king trusted him, but that trust was conditional. Wolsey had to deliver results, and by the late 1520s, he began to falter. The turning point came with Henry's desire for a male heir. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon had produced a daughter, Mary, but no surviving sons. By 1525, Henry was already seeking a solution, and Wolsey was tasked with securing an annulment from the Pope. The matter was not merely personal. Dynastic security depended on a legitimate male heir. But the problem was political. Catherine was the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. In 1527, Rome was sacked by Charles's forces. Pope Clement VII became effectively his prisoner. Granting an annulment that offended Charles was now impossible without severe consequences. Wolsey tried multiple approaches. He attempted to argue the marriage had been invalid from the start. Invoking Leviticus, he proposed that the case be tried in England under papal authority, hoping to control the outcome. None of it worked. Clement delayed, avoided, and ultimately refused to authorize an annulment. Henry's frustration grew. In 1529, the final blow came. A special court convened in England, presided over by Cardinal Campeggio, and Wolsey was supposed to rule on the matter. But the proceedings were suspended. Henry saw it as a betrayal or worse, incompetence. By October, Wolsey was stripped of the chancellorship and most of his titles. He was charged under praemunire, the accusation that he had exercised papal authority in England, a violation of royal supremacy. The man who had once been the king's most trusted adviser was now isolated. Wolsey was allowed to retreat to his archbishopric in York, but in 1530, as suspicion mounted that he was still plotting to return to influence, he was summoned to London. He never arrived. He died at Leicester Abbey in November, aged around 57, likely of natural causes. Though under arrest, Wolsey's fall marked more than just the end of a career. It marked the unravelling of a political model, one in which the church, the papacy, and royal favour had operated in tandem. Within a few years, Henry would reject papal authority altogether, break from Rome, and declare himself supreme head of the Church of England. Thomas Wolsey never led an army. He never claimed royal blood. But for nearly 2 decades, he stood at the centre of English power-driving policy, shaping diplomacy and guiding a young king. His rise was unprecedented. His fall was inevitable. In Tudor England, power that wasn't born from the throne could be erased by a single royal decision. Wolsey rose by the king's favour, and he fell when it turned. France, 18th century. The court of Louis XV was a maze of etiquette, alliances, and calculated ambition. Official titles and noble lineage meant influence, but proximity to the king often meant more. Among courtiers, few held such proximity or such sway as Jeanne Antoinette, poisoned, known to history as Madame de Pompadour. She was not born into aristocracy. Her father was a financier, her mother a salonier, but from a young age, Jeanne Antoinette was groomed for the court. Educated, intelligent, and politically astute, she entered Versailles not just to charm, but to wield influence. In 1745, she caught the attention of Louis XV at a masked ball. Within months, she was installed at Versailles as his official mistress, given the title Marquise de Pompadour, and placed at the centre of court life. But her impact went beyond the personal. For nearly 2 decades, she held the king's confidence, not just in private matters, but in matters of state. She participated in the appointment of ministers, supported France's alliance with Austria. In the diplomatic revolution of 1756, and backed military decisions during the 7 Years' War, historians still debate the extent of her role in policy-making. But her correspondence and the records of court observers leave little doubt. Pompadour was more than a favourite. She was a political player. She supported Enlightenment thinkers, protected writers like Voltaire, and promoted the arts. The École Militaire, the porcelain works at Sèvres, and several architectural projects bore her patronage. She understood the importance of public image and the growing influence of public opinion, commissioning portraits, engravings, and plays that softened her portrayal. Yet despite her contributions, she was relentlessly criticized. Satirical pamphlets accused her of interfering in war, bankrupting the state, and manipulating a once powerful monarch. Louis XV's reign saw France weakened militarily and diplomatically, and some in the court blamed Pompadour's influence. But she retained the king's trust until her death in 1764. He did not take another official mistress after her. For nearly 20 years, she had been the most powerful woman in France without holding a single state office across the Channel. A century earlier, another woman without formal authority reshaped the politics of the English monarchy. Barbara Palmer, Later the Countess of Castlemaine became the chief mistress of Charles II in the early 1660s. Unlike Pompadour, Parma was born into the aristocracy. She married young but quickly used her beauty and connections to gain access to the restored Stuart court. Charles II's reign followed years of Puritan rule under Oliver Cromwell. The Restoration Court was a reaction to that austerity marked by excess, revelry, and personal indulgence. Parma fits seamlessly into that world. She bore 5 children, all acknowledged by the king, and used her status to secure titles, pensions, and influence. More significantly, she became a political intermediary. Foreign diplomats courted her favor, knowing her ability to sway the king. She supported Catholic causes despite England's entrenched anti-Catholic sentiment and was instrumental in promoting Catholic allies within court. One of her key allies, Henry Bennet later, Lord Arlington, rose through court ranks with her support. Her influence waned in the 1670s, replaced by other mistresses like Louise de Carré, a French Catholic, and Nell Gwynn, a Protestant actress. But Parma's legacy had already been established. She demonstrated that royal mistresses could be more than personal companions. They could be political conduits, capable of shaping foreign alliances, court appointments, and the public perception of the monarchy. Neither Madame de Pompadour nor Barbara Palmer held formal office, but their reach extended into every corner of their respective courts. Through them, decisions were tested, alliances negotiated, and favors exchanged. In eras when women were officially excluded from political authority, they found other routes to influence. Their rise was made possible not just by personal relationships, but by the structure of monarchy itself. Courts were closed systems. Access to the sovereign mattered as much, as if not more than formal rank. In such systems, mistresses could become informal ministers, their salons functioning as shadow cabinets. In both France and England, their positions blurred the lines between the personal and the political. Pompadour and Palmer were not alone. Across Europe, royal mistresses played similar roles. Madame de Maintenon, unofficial wife of Louis XIV, was central to the king's later religious policies. Hortense Mancini, niece of Cardinal Mazarin, and mistress of Charles II before Parma, served as an early conduit between French and English political interests. Countess Cosel in Saxony, Maria Luisa of Parma in Spain each played a role in shaping the politics of their era. The backlash they faced was constant. Pamphlets, sermons, and court gossip painted them as dangerous interlopers, women who had overstepped their place. But the truth was simpler. In courts where access was power, they had it, and they used it. Their influence did not come from the ballot box or battlefield. It came from rooms behind closed doors, from whispered conversations, sealed letters, and a position beside the king at the right moment. They weren't elected, they weren't crowned, but in a world built on proximity to power, that was often enough. In courts built on lineage and hierarchy, where bloodlines determined power and gender dictated access, there was one group that existed outside the traditional order and, yet, operated at its center. Eunuchs, men who had been castrated, often at a young age, were barred from producing heirs and owning dynastic titles that made them ideal servants for emperors and sultans who feared disloyalty from ambitious nobles. Over centuries, in palaces from Istanbul to Beijing, these men supposedly disempowered became the gatekeepers of the state. Ming China, early 17th century. The imperial court was in decline. Corruption spread through ministries, factionalism paralyzed decision-making, and the Wanli emperor had largely withdrawn from active governance. In that environment, a eunuch named Wei Zhongxian rose through the ranks, not by virtue of ability, but through manipulation, flattery, and control. Of access, Wei was born Wei Si in 1568 in Anhui province. Castrated in his 20s, likely for economic reasons, he entered palace service and eventually became close to the Tianqi emperor, who ascended the throne in 1620. The emperor was young, poorly educated, and uninterested in statecraft. Wei Zhongxian filled that void. First appointed as director of ceremonial, then promoted to oversee the Eastern Depot, the imperial secret police Wei operated with near total impunity. He installed allies in key posts, censored scholars, and orchestrated purges against the Donglan movement, a Confucian reformist group that opposed corruption. Under his direction, hundreds of officials were imprisoned, tortured, or executed. Memorials to his achievements were erected across the country. One temple even referred to him as 9,000 years, just one step below the emperor's 10,000 years. By 1627, Wei's influence was absolute, but his dominance was tied to one man, the emperor. When the Tianqi emperor died that year, his successor, the Chongzhen emperor, acted swiftly. Wei was dismissed, exiled, and ordered to stand trial. He hanged himself before he could be arrested. His downfall marked one of the bloodiest reversals of fortune in Ming history, with scores of his associates purged in the aftermath. Wei Zhongshan's rise was not an anomaly. The Ming dynasty had long struggled with the power of eunuchs. The earlier reign of the Yongle emperor in the early 15th century had set a precedent by empowering eunuchs with military and diplomatic responsibilities. One of the most famous, Zheng He, led vast naval expeditions across the Indian Ocean, projecting Chinese power from Southeast Asia to East Africa. These voyages were not merely ceremonial, they were statecraft, conducted under the command of a eunuch. But the influence of eunuchs was not limited to China in the Ottoman Empire. The Haroma complex, social and administrative institution, staffed and guarded by eunuchs. The most powerful among them was the Kisla-Akosk, or chief black eunuch, who oversaw the imperial harem in Topkapi Palace. The position was not ceremonial. It controlled access to the Sultan, managed the education and placement of royal women, and supervised communications between the harem and the broader court. By the 17th century, the Kisla-Akosk had become one of the empire's most powerful figures, typically of African origin and forcibly castrated before being brought to Istanbul. These men held no family ties within the empire and were considered loyal solely to the Sultan. Their geographic and biological disconnection from traditional power structures made them, in theory, safe. In practice, it made them indispensable. Hochi Mustafa, Akhtar, who served under Sultan Ahmed I and Sultan Murad IV, wielded extraordinary authority. Through control of the harem, he influenced succession politics, financial administration, and diplomatic messaging. His network extended across the empire, from Cairo to Baghdad, through religious institutions and elite households. Some Kisla-Akosk even controlled the Wukef system, Islamic charitable endowments, giving them control over massive financial resources. Their power, like in China, often depended on the weaknesses of others. When sultans were young or disengaged, you stepped into the vacuum. When ministers squabbled or factions paralyzed the divan, the black eunuch brokered decisions. They carried secrets, relayed orders, and at times decided which orders were delivered at all. Their influence was not without resistance. Ottoman bureaucrats, particularly the Grand Viziers, frequently clashed with eunuchs over appointments, policies, and spending. In moments of political transition, the role of the Kisler Akosk was often questioned, but time and again the system sustained itself. Eunuchs represented a contradiction at the heart of monarchy. Power was supposed to flow through titles, bloodlines, and inheritance. Eunuchs had none of those, but they were ever present. They served the meals, opened the doors, delivered the letters, controlled the chambers and, in doing so, shaped the flow of information. In courts where perception shaped reality, the one who stood between the ruler and the ruled held enormous leverage. Their downfall, when it came, often mirrored their rise, sudden, violent, and complete. Wei Zhongxian's suicide in exile, the execution of numerous Ottoman eunuchs during palace purges, their power existed in shadows. Once the political light shifted, they were exposed, but their legacy remains. In both China and the Ottoman Empire, eunuchs outlasted emperors and sultans. Their records, sometimes censored, often disputed, reveal a class of individuals who turned exclusion into access. They had no heirs, no dynasties, and no armies. But for centuries, behind thick palace walls, they ruled without thrones. England, mid-15th century. The crown was a prize claimed by blood, but held by force. The wars of the Rosazan, ongoing struggle between the houses of Lancaster and York turned noble families into military factions and monarchs into targets. In this age of shifting loyalties and dynastic violence, one man operated above kingship itself, not a sovereign, but a manipulator of sovereigns. Richard Neville, 16th Earl of Warwick, known to history as the Kingmaker. Born in 1428 into the powerful Neville family, Richard inherited wealth, land, and political connections. His marriage to Anne Beauchamp brought with it vast estates and the title of Earl of Warwick. But it was his alignment with the Yorkist cause that propelled him into the centre of English politics. The crown at the time was worn by Henry VI of the House of Lancaster. But Henry was a weak ruler, prone to episodes of mental illness and utterly unsuited for the violent factionalism unfolding around him. The Duke of York, Richard Plantagenet, asserted a claim to the throne, igniting civil war. Warwick threw his support behind the Yorkists, commanding their forces with discipline and strategic insight. In 1460, Warwick helped secure a temporary victory at the Battle of Northampton, capturing Henry VI and placing the Yorkists in effective control of the government. But when Richard of York was killed at the Battle of Wakefield later that year, his son Edward took up the claim. Warwick backed Edward's ascent, both on the battlefield and in the realm of diplomacy. In March 1461, after victory at the Battle of Towton, one of the bloodiest in English history, Edward was proclaimed King Edward IV. Warwick, already commanding the largest private army in England, now stood at the right hand of a grateful king. For a time, he governed in Edward's name. He arranged marriages, negotiated with France and Burgundy, and suppressed Lancastrian resistance. To many, he seemed the real ruler. But the alliance began to unravel. Warwick had envisioned a controlled monarchy, with Edward as a compliant figurehead. Edward had other ideas. In 1464, without Warwick's knowledge or blessing, Edward secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, minor Lancastrian noblewoman, with no foreign alliances or significant dowry. The match was personal, not political, and it bypassed war authority entirely. Tensions escalated as the Woodville family gained influence at court. Warwick, sidelined and humiliated, began plotting. By 1469, He had allied with Edward's younger brother, George, Duke of Clarence, who also resented the Woodvilles and led a rebellion against the crown. Edward was briefly captured, but Warwick lacked the political support to rule outright. He was forced to release the king, and a fragile peace followed. The next phase of Warwick's plan was more audacious. In 1470, after another failed uprising, he fled to France. There, in a stunning reversal, he allied with his former enemy Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI. The agreement was sealed with the marriage of Warwick's daughter Anne to Prince Edward, the Lancastrian heir. In exchange for military support, Warwick pledged to restore Henry VI to the throne. The invasion succeeded. Edward IV was forced into exile, and in October 1470, Henry VI was reinstated as king. But the reality was farcical. Henry was mentally incapacitated and politically powerless. Warwick was the de facto ruler of England. Yet his grip on power was already slipping. The alliance he built was unstable. Clarence grew resentful. Margaret of Anjou distrusted him. And Edward IV, now in Burgundy, was preparing a return. In March 1471, Edward landed in Yorkshire with a small force. Gaining support as he marched south, he retook London and reclaimed the throne. Henry VI was imprisoned in the Tower once more. Warwick confronted Edward at the Battle of Barnet on April 14th. It was a fog-shrouded clash, marked by confusion and friendly fire. Warwick's forces broke. He was killed while fleeing the field. Just weeks later, Edward crushed the remaining Lancastrian resistance at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Prince Edward was killed in battle. Margaret of Anjou was captured. Henry VI was murdered in the Tower. The Wars of the Roses did not end, but Warwick's chapter had closed. Richard Neville never wore the crown, but he shaped its fate more than many who did. He helped install Edward IV, deposed him, reinstated Henry VI, and died trying to hold a throne he never claimed. His rise showed the fragility of kingship in a country ruled as much by military power as by blood. His fall revealed the dangers of overreach in a world where loyalty shifted with every turn of the battlefield. The kingmaker had made kings, but he could not keep them. Washington, Moscow, Riyadh, Beijing. The architecture of power looks different now. Fewer crowns, no royal courts. But the question remains unchanged. Who is really in charge? Across modern governments, titles suggest hierarchy: presidents, prime ministers, cabinets, parliaments. The public sees faces at podiums, hears speeches, watches elections. But real influence often belongs to those behind the curtain, not elected, not accountable, yet positioned within reach of every decision. In the United States, the role of the presidential advisor has long blurred the lines between policy and politics. In 1972, Henry Kissinger held no elected office, yet he shaped American foreign policy more directly than most secretaries of state before or after. As National Security Advisor and later Secretary of State under Nixon and Ford, he directed backchannel negotiations with the Soviet Union, orchestrated the U.S. opening to China, and managed the withdrawal from Vietnam. His decisions weren't subject to public vote, but they redefined the Cold War balance. Decades later, figures like Karl Rove under George W. Bush or Valerie Jarrett under Barack Obama operated as strategic linchpins. Their influence came not from formal rank, but from proximity. Advisors who controlled messaging, appointments, and access to the president, not unlike a royal court. Modernized for the West Wing. In Russia, Vladimir Putin's government projects a vertical of power centered on the president. But even in A state with strongman imagery, the levers of control are distributed and, often hidden. The Federal Security Service, or FSB, evolved from the KGB's framework. Its directors and senior operatives do not stand for election, but they manage internal surveillance, foreign operations, and the maintenance of elite loyalty. One such figure, Nikolai Patrushev, served as FSB director and later as secretary of the Security Council. His role has extended far beyond counterintelligence shaping Russia's strategic worldview, advising on Ukraine, and reinforcing ideological control. Though rarely seen publicly, Patrushev's fingerprints have been traced across state decisions with global consequences. In Saudi Arabia, the king still reigns, but the nature of authority has shifted, with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, widely known as MBS. Though officially heir to the throne, MBS has controlled the kingdom's defense, economic reforms, and foreign policy since 2017. The Vision 2030 plan, the war in Yemen, the assassination of journalist Jamal Khashoggi connected to his directives. Technically second in command, in practice he leads. Titles are flexible. Control is not. In China, the Communist Party makes no attempt to hide its dominance. But within the Politburo Standing Committee, influence is tiered and opaque. Leaders like Wang Huning have guided ideological shifts for decades. A theorist, not a politician in the public sense, Wang helped shape the doctrines of Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and Xi Jinping. He wrote speeches, set intellectual agendas, and pushed forward the party's narrative without campaigning, debating, or appearing before cameras. Not unknown, but unknowable by design. Across Western democracies, power brokers now wear suits instead of robes, but the dynamics remain. Lobbyists influence legislation before it reaches the chamber. Corporate donors shape political agendas before manifestos are drafted. Think tanks produce policy frameworks that are later repeated by elected officials as if they originated them. Consider Frank Luntz, the political consultant who helped shape Republican messaging in the US. His work didn't appear on ballots, but it defined how issues were framed from taxes to healthcare. In the UK, Dominic Cummings, chief advisor to Prime Minister Boris Johnson, became infamous for engineering the Vote Leave campaign and centralizing power in Downing Street. His tenure exposed how unelected figures could steer national policy, often bypassing traditional institutional checks in intelligence communities. The depth of influence is harder to measure, but no less real. In Israel, figures like Meir Dogan, who led Mossad from 2002 to 2011, ran covert operations that shifted regional balances, from Iran's nuclear program to Syrian arms transfers. His face was rarely seen. His actions shaped decades of security policy. The pattern is familiar. Throughout history, states have relied on intermediaries, those who filter, shape, and often decide outcomes on behalf of the figurehead. Whether a cardinal in 17th century France, a regent in Qing China, or a senior advisor in a presidential palace, the reality remains. Visibility is not the same as power. In modern systems, transparency is promised, but complete transparency is a myth. National security, economic planning, and foreign policy all require layers of confidentiality. Within those layers, individuals accumulate influence not visible in polls or press conferences. The 21st century rewards those who can control narratives, suppress dissent, manage perception, and maintain access to the center. As institutions grow more complex, the distance between public authority and private influence often widens. Elections change faces. Systems endure, So the question remains, when a decision is made at the highest level, whose voice was in the room? Whose advice shaped the outcome? Who was consulted and who wasn't? Behind the headlines, beyond the ceremonies, in strategy rooms and encrypted channels, the hidden modern kings still move the pieces. Not crowned, but powerful. Not sovereign, but decisive. Has anything really changed? Or have we simply replaced thrones with offices, robes with suits, and palaces with secure compounds while the machinery of hidden power keeps turning just as it always has?